Welcome back. Well, we'll have a WASDE report coming up in October, but the big report that we're watching right now, Daniel, is this grain stocks report coming up on September 30th. And that typically can be a big market mover, and it can have a few wild cards and throw you by surprise. So as you look at what the trade is expecting coming into this next report, is the thought that we're going to see growing grain stocks?
Generally, yes. The pre-report trade estimates are for just a little bit higher numbers than in the past. But out of this report, what you see is, first of all, an indication of how much, pretty much feed usage that we've had in the last quarter. So that'll have an impact on the WASDE supply demand and balance reports. But then out of this report, you get if there are any adjustments to be made to last year's grain crops, then those will show up. And really, so far, the pre-report estimates are for kind of neutrality, which means if anything happens, it'll be a surprise.
Yeah.
And that could move the market.
Well, and Daniel, that is a great point, because it is kind of looking back at the 2023 crop. And we go back to that season. We know that drought was a major player earlier in the season than it was this year. There's a lot of questions on how big of a crop did we actually have. And so we really won't know until this report on Monday, right?
It'll be the quantified hard numbers that we can go back and check and see algebraically, does it add up or not with regard to what we've used and what our supplies are, and gosh, do we need to make an adjustment? It's kind of how the USDA approaches it.
Brian, when you look at inflation right now, and we're going to talk about inflation and the impact on meat demand, but it's been hard for the Fed to tame inflation. I know you use that term sticky inflation, but what does that mean? And are there expectations that we are going to see inflation slow?
Well, we have seen inflation stick around because of, as you said, the sticky part of it, which is things like housing, insurance, those things that take longer to come down, and that has kept inflation above the Fed's target. Today, that target is about 2%, but inflation sets at about 2.75, 2.8%, so it's not quite there yet.
Consumer sentiment at the same time. I know we recently had a report come out, and, we've been talking about inflation. Are consumers feeling it? Is it impacting their buying habits? But consumer sentiment, that report, what did it show recently?
Well, consumer sentiment is at an all-time low, right? We've seen it really come down to a point to where consumers are really feeling that inflation also at the grocery store, when they go to buy an automobile, even looking at home prices are quite high. So that generally will pull down the consumer sentiment. However, if you look at how we're spending our money, retail sales are up. And we still see those to continue to go. So some of that is being driven by spending down of our excess savings that we've built up in the economy, but also, too, seeing credit card debt continue to rise as well. So as a nation of consumers, we may not have that sentiment there, and eventually that will come, to kind of back off because we can only spend so much.
Okay, so as you look at consumer sentiment and you're seeing that it is at a low, is that impacting meat demand right now, Glenn?
Yes, is the short answer. So in the Meat Demand Monitor, which is beef and pork checkoff supported, project based here at K-State, we track that sentiment. We ask the same questions the University of Michigan actually does as well. And sentiment is quite low per that. A specific number I'll share is in July, only 20% of the U.S. public said they're doing better financially than they were a year earlier. So the remaining 80% are doing the same or worse. So that weighs on, if I'm concerned about my finances, I'm going to tighten my wallet in different ways. And where it's most relevant for the meat industry is foot traffic at restaurants. So meat demand through restaurants, so think away from home consumption, is where we're seeing particularly softer meat demand. Retail, so grocery store for at home, has done okay, but it's the net of those two that form the domestic meat market, and we are seeing some softening in recent months.
When you look at the prices at the grocery store, are beef prices indeed higher? What about pork? What about chicken?
Yeah, so meat prices in general are higher. There's an example of chicken prices a little bit lower. Chicken supplies have grown. You wouldn't say the same about other meat proteins, but this is my earlier comment about margins is important here is, if you increase the cost in the system and demand's just flat, it can even be, a little bit up, you can still experience higher prices. If demand softens some, you can still see higher prices if cost went up enough. And just, to make this point, 25% higher cost of raising a cow compared to 4 years ago works its way through the system in the form of higher prices.
That is a good point. All right. We appreciate all of you joining us this weekend for our College Road Show. We need to take a quick break, and then we'll be back with more U.S. Farm Report.